Hello everyone and welcome to the Sound Mind podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of music psychology. I'm your host Sophia, and as a music psychologist, I'll be guiding you through everything you've ever wondered about music. So whether you're a music lover or just interested in the science of sound, you're in the right place, so stick around. Now, it is Women's History Month, and this week I want to address it. Just after we had International Women's Day last week, it's a time to reflect on the incredible contributions of women across every field. And of course, music is absolutely no exception. Now, women have always been part of music, shaping its sounds, its forms, and its stories. Yet when we look back at history, it often feels like women are missing from the narrative. But women have been composing, performing, and innovating for centuries, despite the fact that structurally they've been underrepresented, overlooked, and undervalued, I would say, at every level of the industry, from performance to composition, production, and leadership. So why does history sound like it was written by men? Why are so many names erased, forgotten, or overshadowed? In this episode, we're going to trace the story of women in music from the medieval era to the modern charts, highlighting not only the barriers that they've faced, but also the incredible ways that women have shaped music, reclaimed spaces, and just transformed the industry. This is a really exciting one. I learned a lot myself while researching for this episode, so I'm excited to share it with you. So let's get into it. Now, when we talk about the history of women in music, it's really easy to assume that in the early days, women just weren't there, that composition, theory, and innovation were built almost entirely by men. But that's not true. Women were always there. They were singing, composing, documenting, preserving. So the real question isn't, were women present? But it's more about, were they allowed to exist and under what conditions? So if we go back to the early medieval period, one of the earliest known female composers is Cassiani, a 9th century Byzantine abbess whose hymns are still performed today. She holds actually a unique place in Byzantine music because she's the only known woman whose music appears in the Byzantine liturgy, which is pretty amazing. And then there's Hildegard von Bingen, who is one of the most well-documented composers of the Middle Ages. Now, what's fascinating about Hildegard isn't just that she composed, it's that she was recognized for it, which immediately tells us something important. Women could create music, but recognition was rare and often conditional. Now, as we move further into the medieval period, music itself became more technical, more codified and academic. We see the emergence of systems like Ars Nova, defined by complex rhythms, advanced notation, and this theoretical precision. But to participate in this world, to compose these ballads or to engage in musical theory, you needed a formal education, some kind of understanding of notation systems and training in subjects like mathematics and philosophy. But guess what? Women were systematically excluded from the institutions that provided that training. They couldn't attend universities or access this elitist musical education. So it wasn't that women lacked creativity, it's that they were locked out of the systems that defined what serious music even was at that time. Now, knowing that, it would be easy to assume that women just disappeared from the musical landscape at this point because, maybe they became passive listeners rather than active contributors. But that's not true either. While women were excluded from formal institutions, they created and sustained musical life in other spaces, particularly in religious communities like convents and Beguine societies. These weren't passive environments, they were actually centers of musical activity, where music was embedded into daily life through worship, ritual, and community structure. Now, women weren't just singing occasionally in these structures, they were engaging with music every single day. In Beguine communities, for example, women formed choirs known as schola and performed regularly as part of these religious services. They were trained in music and Latin, which shows this real level of musical education, even if it wasn't formally recognized. And their music wasn't hidden away. It was heard by local communities attending Mass, meaning that their voices were part of a public soundscape, even if history didn't always credit them. But some women went even further. They didn't just perform, they actually composed entire religious works. One example is Juliana of Cornillon, who played a key role in developing the Feast of Corpus Christi, which is a major liturgical celebration that included original music compositions. Now, this is one of the earliest examples of a woman shaping these large-scale musical and religious practices. But beyond composition and performance even, women played a crucial role in preserving music as well. So nuns were responsible for writing and copying manuscripts, adding notation, and documenting musical works in detail. And their contributions show deep musical understanding and intellectual engagement with theory. So this idea that women weren't able to hold up to this intellectual side of music really doesn't hold up at all. They weren't just performers, they were these curators, archivists, and interpreters of musical knowledge overall. But at the same time, there were these very, very real restrictions placed on them. Certain musical styles, so for example, complex polyphony, were often forbidden to women altogether. And this wasn't just about ability, but about perception. Women's voices were sometimes described as seductive, distracting, and even morally dangerous, linked to ideas like sirens. So the control of women in music wasn't just structural, it was psychological and moral as well. And yet, even with those limitations, women still found ways to engage with advanced music. They studied it, preserved it, and documented it. A powerful example here is the Las Huelgas Codex, a manuscript kept by nuns that includes these complex polyphonic works. So even when women weren't allowed to perform certain styles, they still helped to ensure that those styles survived beyond their era. Now, what we see in this period is a clear pattern. Women's musical expression was allowed but controlled by access to education, by moral perception, and by the spaces that they were permitted to occupy. So when we ask whether women were part of early music, the answer is yes, but more accurately, women were never absent from music. They were simply confined to where and how they were allowed to participate. Now, as we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, something interesting starts to happen. Women become more visible than ever before, but that visibility definitely comes with conditions. This is a period of transition. Women move from being primarily private, domestic performers into more public-facing musicians, virtuosos, singers, and even published composers. But despite this shift, the system that they're entering is still deeply unequal, and recognition doesn't quite follow visibility here. So women were especially encouraged to excel in performance, particularly as singers and pianists. The piano, actually, in particular, was considered a quote-unquote ladies' instrument, something appropriate, refined, and modest. It could be played in the home, in salons, or in controlled social settings, and because of that, many women became incredibly skilled pianists. You see figures like Clara Schumann, who was not only a virtuoso performer, but one of the most respected pianists and composers of her time, balancing this career of international concerts with the expectations placed on her as a wife and mother, which was so damn amazing. There's also Maria Anna Mozart, who, yes, is Mozart's sister, and she was widely recognized for her prestigious talent. even though she was never afforded the same opportunities to compose or perform publicly as her brother was, which really highlights the systemic limitations placed on women even in musical families. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't even know that Mozart had a sister, especially as talented as she was. And even in vocal performance, you have artists like Jenny Lind, famously dubbed the Swedish Nightingale, whose exceptional soprano voice made her an international sensation in the 19th century. Lind's fame transcended Europe and America, and her story continues to captivate audiences today. Her life and career were even dramatized in The Greatest Showman, which really introduced her story to a modern generation and just really helps to underscore how women in music have long held this power to inspire, captivate, and dominate the public stage despite the structural limitations. But here's the main distinction here. Women were often celebrated as performers, not as creators, because when it came to composition, things became much more complicated. Women were actively composing during this period, often at a high level, actually, but their work was frequently overshadowed, dismissed, or even attributed to the men around them. Take Fanny Mendelssohn, for example, who composed extensively, but had some of her works published under her brother, Felix Mendelssohn's name. Or Louise Farrenc, who not only composed symphonies, but actually became a professor at the Paris Conservatoire, which was an incredibly rare achievement for a woman at that time. There's also Mariana Martins, who wrote masses and symphonies and was also deeply embedded in Vienna's musical life. Now, these women weren't exceptions because they were unusually talented, let's say, but they were examples of what women were capable of, despite the limitations placed on them. And unfortunately, those limitations were not subtle. Women were often told explicitly that they lacked the innate creativity required to be composers, that composition, the act of creating something original, was something inherently male. So imagine that for a second. Imagine creating music, pouring your thoughts and emotions into something, while being told that biologically you are not capable of true creativity. And this is where the psychology becomes really important, because this is all about belief. When a system repeatedly tells you that you're less capable, less original, less worthy, it doesn't just limit your opportunities, it actually starts to shape your self-perception. And this is where we can trace the early roots of things like imposter syndrome and internalized limitation in creative fields, especially for women. Women weren't just navigating external barriers, they were navigating the psychological weight of being told that they didn't belong. But at the same time, there were spaces where women did hold influence, just not always in the ways that we traditionally recognize. And one of the most important of these was salon culture. So across Europe, women hosted salons in their home. These intellectual and artistic gatherings where composers, performers, and thinkers would all come together to share ideas and perform music. And these salons became key sites of cultural exchange, shaping musical taste and fostering new works. So even when women weren't always centered as composers in public institutions, they were still shaping the direction of music behind the scenes as patrons, curators, and connectors. But public performance did still come with tension. Women on stage were often viewed with this level of suspicion. There was an ongoing association between public visibility and moral compromise, which meant that female performers had to constantly navigate how they were perceived. And when women did compose, their work was often treated as secondary, something supplementary rather than central to the canon. And some even resorted, as a result, to publishing under pseudonyms or initials, hiding their identity altogether in order to be taken seriously. And that's such a sad reality, isn't it? So again, we just see this pattern repeating. Women are present, they're contributing, but their recognition is filtered, controlled, and often denied. But with that being said, I would say that the 19th century does mark the beginning of slow progress. Women gradually start gaining access to more formal training, including conservatoires. Some begin forming their own ensembles, carving out spaces where they can perform and collaborate on their own terms. These shifts are small, but they do matter because they lay the groundwork for what comes next. So when we look at this era, it's, again, not a story of absence. It's almost a story of erasure. The systems around them just determined whose work was remembered and whose was attributed and whose was taken seriously. And psychologically, it really leaves a lasting imprint because when you're allowed to participate but not fully recognized and not validated for your work, you start to question your place, your voice, and your authority as well. And I think the consequences of that still leak into a lot of areas that we can observe today. But let's move on into the late 19th and early 20th century, where the music industry as we recognize it today is beginning to take shape. We start to see more formalized careers, recording technologies, publishing systems, and global audiences. And within this emerging industry, women are pushing boundaries in ways that are often overlooked. But once again, they're navigating a system that wasn't built for them. At this point in history, women are increasingly entering music as professionals. Composers, finally, performers, and educators. However, their participation is still shaped by these strict societal expectations. Many are channeled into what was considered quote-unquote appropriate work. Teaching, performing in domestic settings, or composing these smaller scale pieces, often referred to as parlor music. This was music designed for the home. It was intimate, controlled, and socially acceptable. And yet, even within these constraints, women began to break through. Take Amy Beach, for example. She became the first American woman to compose and publish a symphony, proving that women were not only capable of large-scale composition, but they could succeed in it. Or Cécile Chaminade, whose works were hugely popular around Europe, and who actually became the first female composer to receive the Legion d'Honneur. And then there's Ethel Smith, known not only for her operas, but for her active role in the women's suffrage movement, using music as both art and activism. And what these women represent is a shift. They're no longer just participating in music, they're actively expanding what's possible. And it's not just composers at this point. We've still got amazing virtuoso performers like Teresa Carreño. Now, she was often called the Valkyrie of the piano, and people like her were commanding international stages, challenging expectations of what women could do, technically and artistically. And in the early 20th century, composers like Florence Price made history as the first African-American woman to have a symphony performed by a major orchestra, which is an achievement that sits at the intersection of both gender and racial barriers, which is so phenomenal. And at the same time as all of this, access to education is also slowly beginning to shift. Now, music actually becomes one of the earlier professions where women are able to access higher education, particularly through conservatoires. But even this comes with a caveat. It's often framed around preparing women to become teachers, not necessarily innovators or leaders. So again, access is expanding, but expectations are still being managed. And then something else begins to emerge. A new cultural identity, often referred to as the new woman. Now, in the early 20th century, women start pushing more visibly into leadership roles within music. You see figures like Ethel Leginska and Antonia Brico stepping onto the conductor's podium, leading orchestras at a time when that role was almost exclusively male. And this is a significant shift because conducting isn't just about music, it's all about authority, control, and leadership. And for women to occupy that space challenges not just musical norms, but societal ones. But one of the most overlooked aspects of this period is that women weren't just performers or composers. They were also shaping the infrastructure of music itself. Women were among the earliest recordists, ethnomusicologists, and archivists of sound. So, for example, researchers like Frances Densmore were documenting indigenous music traditions, preserving the cultural histories that might otherwise have been lost. And these weren't small contributions. This was foundational work in how we understand global music today. But at the same time, women were also present in the earliest days of the recording industry. Artists like Mamie Smith were pioneers in recorded music, helping to establish blues as a recorded genre in the 1920s, which is such a cool thing to be part of, is it not? And beyond performance, women were even building their own systems. Victoria Hernandez, for instance, founded a record label in 1927, making her one of the earliest female music executives, which is incredible. So again, this challenges the narrative. Women weren't just participating in music, they were helping build the industry itself. And yet, despite all of this progress, the barriers didn't disappear. Women's work was still frequently dismissed as sentimental, superficial, and less serious than that of their male counterparts. And this kind of language matters because it subtly reinforces the idea that women's creativity is inherently less. And for many women, especially those navigating marriage and societal expectations, these pressures had real consequences. Take Ruth Crawford Seeger, for example. Despite being an innovative composer, much of her later work shifted towards transcribing and teaching, as her compositional confidence was gradually undermined by external expectations. And this is where the psychological layer comes in again here. Women are allowed to participate at this moment in time, but their paths are being subtly shaped towards teaching instead of composing, preservation instead of innovation, and overall just towards support roles rather than leadership. And over time, those patterns don't just shape female careers, they shape identity. So this period is complex because on one hand, it's a moment of expansion. Women are gaining visibility, entering institutions, and even building parts of the industry. But on the other hand, the same underlying beliefs persist. That women are less capable, less authoritative, and less original. So once again, we see that tension. Women are there, women are contributing, but the system is still deciding how much they're allowed to be seen and in what capacity. Now, as we move into the early to mid 20th century, something shifts again, but this time it's a little bit different. Music doesn't just become a space of participation or expression, it actually becomes a space of resistance. And at the center of that resistance are women, particularly Black women, who are using music not just to be heard, but to tell the truth. Because for many of these women, music wasn't just art, it was survival, protest, and a form of identity. Now, long before the civil rights movement formally took shape, women in blues and jazz were already doing that work through their voices, their lyrics, and their presence on stage. Take Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, often referred to as the mothers of the blues. Their music openly addressed topics that were considered taboo at that time, like poverty, violence, sexuality, and independence. They challenged Victorian ideas of what women, especially Black women, were supposed to be: quiet, controlled, and respectable. And instead, they were unapologetic. Their lyrics, their performances, even their styling became forms of resistance. They weren't just singing songs, they were asserting identity. In many ways, early blues women were acting as these kind of cultural disruptors, even civil rights workers, using music to challenge both racial and gender norms. And what's particularly powerful here is that this resistance wasn't always overt. It was embedded in the music itself, in the tone of voice, the improvisation, even the phrasing. The way that something was sung carried just as much meaning as the words themselves. And this idea of music as protest becomes even more explicit with Billie Holiday. Her performance of Strange Fruit is often cited as one of the most powerful protest songs ever recorded. It directly confronts the lynching of Black Americans, turning a jazz performance into a moment of this kind of collective witnessing. And what's important here is not just the lyrics here, it's the delivery. It's, this level of stillness and restraint, the emotional weight that comes with that performance. And from a psychological perspective, this is where music becomes a tool for processing trauma collectively. It allows people to not just hear the truth, but to feel it, especially for those actually experiencing it in that moment. And for over 2 decades, Billie Holiday continued to perform that song despite the backlash and risk that came with that. And that's exactly what resistance in music looks like. It's persistence. But the resistance here, it wasn't just limited to singers, actually. So women were also pushing boundaries instrumentally and structurally, challenging this idea that they were only meant to be vocalists. Take Memphis Minnie, who's a guitarist whose technical skills rivaled and often outshone her male contemporaries. Or Mary Lou Williams, a composer and arranger who played a key role in shaping modern jazz. And these women weren't just participating in music, they were really helping to innovate within it. And that's so incredible because one of the key struggles for women in jazz was visibility, not just being seen as performers, but being recognized as musicians, composers, and band leaders. And then you've got figures like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who blended gospel and blues with electric guitar, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become rock and roll. She broke racial and gender boundaries, performing with this new level of energy and technical ability that really challenged the expectations of what women could do on stage. And later, artists like Alice Coltrane would go on to expand the spiritual and sonic boundaries of jazz even further, bringing in these different elements of meditation, transcendence, and experimental sound as well. And I would say what connects all of these artists is this idea of claiming space. In an industry completely dominated by men, where women were often marginalized or confined to these certain roles, simply stepping onto a stage, holding an instrument, leading a band, taking creative control, was an act of defiance. And this is what some scholars refer to as a politics of refusal. A refusal to conform to expectations, to be reduced to a stereotype and be silenced. But this resistance didn't just happen through performance, it also happened through content as well. Lyrics became a space for cultural critique. Artists addressed inequality, exploitation, and the realities of their lived experiences. They challenged not just gender norms, but also these racial hierarchies and cultural appropriation. And this legacy continues today. Organizations like the Berklee Institute for Jazz and Gender Justice, founded by Terry Lynn Carrington, are actively working to address the gender imbalance in jazz. Similarly, groups like the Women in Jazz organization are pushing for greater visibility and equity. So the fight definitely hasn't ended, it's evolved. But if we bring it back to this area, the 1930s to the 1950s, the key shift is that music becomes one of the first spaces where women, especially Black women, could really tell the truth openly. Not safely, not without consequence, but truthfully. And I think that's so powerful because when your voice is suppressed in society and you find a space where it can exist unapologetically, that space becomes more than creative, it becomes liberating. So I would say this period is all about the moment that music transforms into this tool for resistance, identity, and reclamation. And the women who led that transformation, often without being fully recognized for it. Now, as we move into the second half of the 20th century, something does fundamentally shift. Up until this point, women in music have been present, influential, and often groundbreaking, but still operating within these systems that define their roles for them. And what we start to see from the 1960s onwards is this transition from participation to power. This is the era where women don't just contribute to music, they begin to reshape it entirely. In the 60s, the sound of popular music was dominated by girl groups and soul, particularly through labels like Motown. Groups like the Supremes, led by Diana Ross, alongside acts like the Ronettes and Martha and the Vandellas, define the era with these polished harmonies and tightly controlled production styles. But even here, there is a limitation. These groups are often shaped heavily by producers, labels, and industry executives. Their image, their sound, even their choreography is so carefully constructed. So while women are highly visible, control still largely sits behind the scenes. But at the same time, another movement is emerging, one that begins to shift that balance. You've got singer-songwriters like Joni Mitchell and Janis Joplin. They start taking ownership of their narratives. Their music is more personal, more confessional, and more politically engaged as well. Especially with artists like Janis Joplin, there's a rawness, this kind of emotional intensity that challenged expectations of how women are supposed to sound. So already we see a shift beginning here from being shaped by the industry to beginning to speak from within it. And by the 1970s, that shift really deepens. Women are no longer just voices, they're becoming defining forces within genres. You've got artists like Tina Turner, who reinvents herself as this rock powerhouse, commanding stages with this level of energy and presence that honestly redefines performance. Stevie Nicks, as part of Fleetwood Mac, helps create Rumours, one of the best-selling albums of all time. And then at the same time, you've got songwriters like Carole King, Dolly Parton, and Joni Mitchell continuing to redefine what it means to write music as a woman, moving beyond just performance into authorship and storytelling. What's happening here is this level of diversification. Women are no longer confined to a single sound or role. They're everywhere. You've got artists like Patti Smith, who fuses punk with poetry, and Donna Summer, who becomes the queen of disco, dominating global dance floors. And then we enter the 80s, and everything becomes bigger. This is the era of MTV, visual identity, and global superstardom. Women don't just participate in this movement, they literally dominate it. And at the center of this is Madonna. Madonna really constructs an identity, and then she reconstructs it over and over again. She plays with sexuality, religion, power, and controversy, constantly challenging expectations of what a female artist can be. She takes control not just of her sound, but of her image, her narrative, and the trajectory of her whole career. And I think that's part of the key shift here. This is where women begin to control their image, sexuality, and storytelling. Alongside her, you've got artists like Whitney Houston, whose vocal ability sets this whole new standard for technical excellence and just emotional delivery overall. And Cyndi Lauper, whose music becomes synonymous with individuality and self-expression. And in rock and new wave, you've got artists like Pat Benatar, Blondie fronted by Debbie Harry, and Heart push women to the forefront of genres that were once heavily male-dominated. And in the 90s, that momentum exploded into something even more complex. I would say this is the era of contradiction. Women are more powerful than ever, but also navigating new forms of pressure. In alternative and grunge, artists like Alanis Morissette release albums like Jagged Little Pill, which bring female anger, vulnerability, and emotional honesty into the mainstream in a way that feels almost confrontational. Bands like the Cranberries further expand that emotional and sonic range. But at the same time, pop and R&B are dominated by powerhouse vocalists like Mariah Carey, Celine Dion, and again, Whitney Houston, who combine this technical mastery with global commercial success. And then in hip hop, women begin to redefine their place in the genre that had often marginalized them. You've got artists like Missy Elliott and Queen Latifah expand what female presence in hip hop looks like, moving beyond being featured voices to being creators, innovators, and leaders. And then there's the mainstreaming of something much simpler, but just as powerful: girlhood as a collective identity. Groups like the Spice Girls introduce girl power into global culture, making empowerment accessible, commercial, and widely understood. So, what defines this entire era is, I would say, a shift from expression to ownership. Women are no longer just participating in music anymore. They're controlling it, they're defining it, and building identities, brands, and legacies, honestly, on their own terms. And psychologically, that's huge as well, because control over your narrative, how you're seen, heard, and understood, is a form of power. But even here, it's not complete freedom, because with this visibility comes scrutiny. With the power comes pressure, and women are now expected to be everything at once: talented, beautiful, marketable, authentic, and just constantly evolving. But I would say, despite all of that, this era definitely marks a turning point. I think it's the moment where women move from being shaped by the industry to actively shaping it themselves. Now, that brings us to today, the modern industry. Now, when we look at the music industry today, the landscape appears, at first glance, radically different from what it was even just a few decades ago. Women dominate the charts, headline stadiums, and command global attention. Artists like Beyoncé, Taylor Swift, Dua Lipa, and Olivia Rodrigo are, just off the top of my head, cultural icons, celebrated not only for their talent, but for their ability to shape trends, influence fashion, and speak directly to millions of fans. In terms of visibility and influence in the public eye, women have never been more prominent. But visibility does not necessarily equate to power. Behind the scenes, the industry remains scaringly unequal. So I've got some stats for you, which I guarantee will blow your mind. So in 2020, only 12.9% of songwriters were women, creating a ratio of roughly 7 men for every female songwriter, which is pretty wild. But across a 9-year span, 57% of songs lacked any female songwriting input altogether. And for the year 2020 alone, that figure rises to 65%. And when it comes to production, the numbers are even more stark. Women held just 2% of producing roles across the Billboard Hot 100 in 2020. And that means that while women are the voices that define the soundtrack of our lives, the critical decisions shaping how that music is made, arranged, and brought to the world are still overwhelmingly controlled by men. Women's presence is celebrated when it's performative and consumable, but systemic power remains largely inaccessible, so the ability to influence production, publishing, and distribution. And this imbalance isn't just structural, it's also deeply cultural. Now, there was a 2021 survey conducted by TuneCore, which included 400 women's creatives like artists, songwriters, producers, and DJs. And this revealed that 64% of those identified sexual harassment and objectification as a major barrier to their work. Many also highlighted ageism as a pervasive challenge, with 38% reporting that the industry's obsession with youth disadvantages women, forcing them to achieve visibility and success before these societal expectations around motherhood, aging, or image standards can interfere. And that implication is really stark because even as women gain recognition, they must constantly navigate an industry that scrutinizes their bodies, their choices, and their personal lives in ways that men are rarely asked to. And psychologically, this creates a complex dynamic. Visibility can be empowering, but when it's not matched with agency, it kind of becomes this double-edged sword. Women are celebrated on stage and in media, yet their creative control is often limited or undervalued. And like we spoke of earlier, this tension feeds imposter syndrome and creates this constant pressure to perform, conform, and innovate simultaneously. And for many, the path to visibility is also the path to exhaustion, requiring this relentless negotiation between public success and this private creative autonomy. But despite these structural challenges, women continue to redefine what it means to succeed in music today. Beyoncé exemplifies this duality. She's both an artist and an entrepreneur, commanding creative control over every element of her work, from songwriting and production to visuals and marketing. I think Ray is another prime example of an artist that does this. Even though she's still an independent artist, she still makes sure to have autonomy over her works in every way that she can. And she is an absolutely phenomenal, I wouldn't even say upcoming artist anymore, because she's definitely achieved the success that she deserves. It's absolutely incredible. But yeah, she's definitely a prime example of that as well. But I think even in these cases, the paradox is clear. Success at the top end of the industry doesn't change the systemic realities that govern this access and opportunity. While women can dominate the charts, the pipelines that feed those charts remain male-dominated. Visibility has, of course, expanded dramatically, but the control element of things has definitely not caught up. Women are being seen, but the levels of influence remain largely out of reach. So I think that the modern music industry is a story of contrast on so many different levels. Extraordinary progress in public presence alongside persistent inequality in structural power. Women's voices arguably have never been louder, more celebrated, or more influential culturally. Yet the infrastructure of music still reflects centuries-old patterns of exclusion. And this creates this kind of tension. Women are occupying the spotlight, yet the stage itself, the design, the rules, the pathways, is still often controlled by others. Being celebrated for talent while lacking this systemic authority generates this ongoing negotiation between identity and opportunity. And it really shapes careers, creative confidence, and honestly, the long-term trajectories in ways that echo historical patterns of marginalization, patterns that stretch all the way back to medieval convents, to 20th century recording studios. Now, as we've seen throughout this episode, the history of women in music isn't about absence, it's about recognition. Women were never missing from the story. They've always been composing, performing, innovating, and resisting at every stage. But the difference is whether they were seen, credited, and remembered. And while progress has been made, definitely lots of it, that story is definitely still unfolding. Recognition is still catching up with reality. So, to wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with this. What is one song by a woman who has shaped who you are? A song that holds a memory, shifted your perspective, or helped you through something you couldn't quite put into words. Maybe it's one that you've loved for years, or maybe it's one that you're just discovering now. Either way, take a moment to sit with it and think about the woman behind it. The voice, the story, the impact. There's so many layers, because when we start to recognize these contributions, we don't just change how we listen to music, we change the story of music itself. I would absolutely love to hear your answers to this over on Instagram and on Threads. So please do reach out at the Soundmind Talks. I absolutely love engaging with these kinds of discussions with you guys over there. So definitely come and say hi. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate or review on wherever you're listening and share it with someone who loves music just as much as you do, or may just find it interesting. I know that I absolutely loved doing this episode. It was so fascinating to dive into every era and just really put a voice and spotlight to some of the iconic female figures that have shaped the industry. It's just so amazing. Don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. But until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and I'll see you on the Sound Mind.